Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another weather forecast. So, yesterday's video, I talked about a severe weather event that is going to be impacting Texas, um, basically for today and tomorrow. So, today and tomorrow, and then it's going to move on into Florida, and nothing too severe from this, but today is the main risk for this event, so I'm going to be talking more about it just because it is kind of happening as we speak. So this is the current radar in Texas. We just have a few storms that are basically firing right now. The SPC has issued some mesoscale discussions, and here's the United States. All right, so here is Texas, and here's our SPC outlooks. So if we look back in this website, we can see the marginal and the slight risk. You can see the general area this is going to be impacting, as well as mesoscale discussions for these storms that are currently firing right off the dry line right here. We even have a mini little supercell right here, which I believe is creating some pretty big hail. Earlier there was um, nice purple EBZ somewhere around these colors, which usually indicates hail. So here's our SPC outlook. We have a 2% tornado risk for basically the majority of Texas here, and a little bit into Oklahoma, and a 15% hash region for some pretty big hail near the Mexico-Texas border right here. 15% and 5% surrounding that. Basically, hail is the main threat just because these storms are going to be elevated. So here real quick, we'll look at the 500 millibar map. So we can see here, this is our high pressure ridge. Down here we have a low pressure system, which is just very negatively tilted. So I've talked about negative tilts a decent amount recently. Essentially, that's when the axis kind of tilts more to the top left corner or the northwest. But this is our low pressure because we can see our wind contours moving kind of like this. And as I've talked about before, that is kind of the rotation thing. That's your low pressure system. So I wouldn't say it's centered right over here, but just for simplicity's sake, we're gonna say there's low pressure right here. So again, high pressure system up here. This has been bringing pretty nice temperatures for this whole region here, especially for the winter time. And there's a low pressure somewhere up here. It's very difficult. It's not too well defined. They're kind of all over the place, but we have this kind of a linear low pressure system which will move through the southeast. I don't think there's too much severe weather to be had with this system specifically, but today is our main risk. So we're going to talk about that. So I'm going to look up a little bit closer into the southern Great Plains here. Uh, here's our states. I'll outline them real quick. Again, Texas is here, Louisiana, Arkansas. People like it when I do these outlines, so I'll keep these coming. Here's our states right here in case you can't see them very well, and these won't be moving. So if we look at the HRRR model, we can see something called simulated reflectivity, and the HRRR is very good at this, right? So it kind of gives us a general idea of what's going to pan out. So at 21Z, which is 3 p.m., we have a few storms of fire here along the dry line, which I'll look at real quick in a second. And as these move on throughout the night, they're going to kind of become more congealed. And some of these southern storms down here have a good chance with some high cape to form some good hail. So again, I talked about this on the real radar. Here's our storms firing right now. 4 o'clock right now, same thing. It's basically just showing the swath of storms. In the south here, move down there, nothing really is up quite yet. There's a few little dots right here, but otherwise nothing's going on at the moment. So what the initiating boundary for this is actually a dry line. So it's been a while since I've really been able to say, hey, here's a dry line. But essentially a dry line is when you have this line right here. On one side you have the more moist temperatures, more moist dew points. So here we have 60 dew point, 62, 58. And this is all moist air. On this side we have 28s and 32s. Essentially what a dew point is at what temperature will air condense into cloud cover and clouds and storms. So essentially there's more moist air on the east side of this dry line and less moist air on the left side or the west side. So right along this dry line, I didn't draw that too well, but right here, this is where storms are going to be firing off of. So moving off this way, which we can see through the mean layer cape, you can see these vectors, right? So this will tell us what the direction of the storms will move. So in here, you can see here's a little wind barb. A little hard to stand at all these lines, but there's wind barbs that are pointing this direction, essentially. So any storms that fire are going to move in a northeast track. They'll go to the northeast. I think it's called southwesterly, if I'm not mistaken. But one of the issues that I talked about in my last forecast was how are these storms really going to have any cape and how unstable will they really be? Earlier, it didn't look too well for the Cape values, but now we are starting to hit our early thousands and 1500s here, and that's enough in February. It's still the early winter months, so these storms do have enough to fire. If I looked at this in the spring, though, I would say this is not going to happen. There's not going to be really too much convection going on here. But these purples and the blues here, they're showing a decent amount of Cape, enough for these storms to really fire and get going, but nothing incredibly significant either. However, the main issue with these storms is the fact that they're going to be elevated. So essentially what that means is that surface Cape is pretty low, right? Surface instability, there's not much to be had. And what happens is that these storms will actually form higher up in the atmosphere. They still come with the same risks, but they don't really have tornado risks because tornadoes are surface-based storms. So this is a sounding I took earlier today, and we can see here, here's our Cape values in here, right? This whole little area here, this is a decent, it's pretty fat Cape. It's quite a bit of it. But you can see here, it's a pretty low top storm that ends at about 280 millibars, and it forms, this is our LCL, which is basically just where the clouds begin. That would happen around 800 millibars. So a pretty low top storm and a storm that goes up pretty high, right? Not really cloud cover in this area of the hodograph, or excuse me, SKU-T. That's usually where we'd see our tornadoes. However, there is still chances of tornadoes to be dropped from this. There's enough good shear in the lower levels. Here we can see our hodograph kind of bending like that and showing our supercell kind of like that. Again, it's not looking too good for tornadoes, but it is quite the event, and there are pretty strong what is called lapse rates in these lower levels. So essentially, how quickly does the temperature drop? And you can see here, it's a very steep line. Something I talked about once was, you can imagine in school you usually have your X and Y plane, your x-axis, along this line, and y across this line. Essentially, what a SKU-T does is keeps your x-axis like so, but makes your y-axis a little bit more slanted, kind of like this, right? This is our line of temperature. All these little lines, that's equal temperature. Not amazingly drawn. You can kind of see them dashed right in here. Those are our lines of temperature, and temperature is decreasing along those lines much more rapidly than you usually expect to see. So these storms will have quite a bit of instability to work with once they break that mini cap right here, but that'll be broken pretty easily. And that's been shown by the HRRR as well. So we're gonna start with a pretty clear mode based on the dry line here. Right, here's our dry line, and that's where storms are gonna fire, and we'll see that a lot more as we get into the spring months, especially for the Great Plains. This dry southeast land is often where these storms will form off of, right here on this dry line. So I'm gonna highlight the dry line right here, and now I'm going to move to the simulated reflectivity. See, just about in that vicinity, right? We do have some stuff that forms ahead of the dry line. Once they hit that dry line, they hit that moist air, and they really start to blow up, kind of like that. So that's our main progression for the system. Again, right off the dry line into a pretty clustered mode. Probably not too good for discrete supercells, but there could be a few, pretty strong hailers here in the south, especially again with those more discrete environments down here. So we'll see how that pans out, and we could see some wind damage. It doesn't look to be a huge significant event day, but I'll see how it pans out, and if anything goes crazier after the fact, we'll look at that in our next forecast. But with that, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.